What does not disqualify you from certain types of corporate spaces, partially because I think we've had to litigate some of this stuff, like your hairstyle or like what bathroom you use, all of those things. Some of that stuff has had to be litigated, but the concepts around the attitudes that we have around body positivity, around disclosing what was considered too personal and just one's presentation are leaps and bounds from where they were when I was coming up, where it was like, this is how you dress, like you never step over the line. So there's a lot of change that I think if you've only been exposed to this way, it's hard to imagine that it used to be different.
Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. Now it's time for my favorite segment where we get to hear from you, our listeners, about your favorite fashion moments.
Hi, I'm Nikki from Maryland, and of all of the amazing fashion moments that I've experienced, hands down, my favorite fashion moment is when I stalked and met Der Kaiser, better known as Karl Lagerfeld, in Soho. This was back in March 2010, so it's actually almost 11 years to the day since I met him. At the time, I was a newbie fashion PR intern working in the heart of Soho. One evening, I was leaving my internship and I noticed several Chanel vans outside of the Mercer Kitchen, which happened to be one of Karl Lagerfeld's favorite restaurants and hotels in New York. Now, for additional context, at the time, I was truly Chanel obsessed. Like, I watched every Chanel show, I had just gotten my first Chanel bag, just moved to New York. I had dreams of interning or working at Chanel or attending a Chanel show in Paris. So my heart is literally racing when I saw like all the Chanel vans outside of the Mercer Kitchen. So I walked up to one of the vans and I asked the driver what was going on. And thankfully he was super chatty because he gave me so much tea. If he had not had such a big mouth, I never would have met Karl. So I walked up and asked him, what is going on? And he said, oh, they're shooting the Fall/Winter 2010 campaign for the next few days in meatpacking. And then I asked, is Karl Lagerfeld inside? And he replied, yes, he is. So the driver said that they would be departing around 9 a.m. the following day. So if I wanted to catch a glimpse of Uncle Karl, to come back around then. I was literally beside myself and I could not understand my good fortune. I was going to meet Karl Lagerfeld the next day. So I went to my Harlem apartment and searched high and low for a Chanel-inspired look. And I did actually happen to have that on deck. I wore a cream tweed blazer lined with black trim, a cream silk ruffle blouse with a pussy bow, and high-waisted black silk trousers, lots of pearls, and then, of course, my Chanel bag. So the next morning, I arrived just before 9 a.m. and I'm just hanging out in front of the Mercer Kitchen, hoping to catch a glimpse of my favorite designer. Mind you, my internship starts at 9. But I was willing to be late for my internship if I could meet Karl Lagerfeld, right? So 2 hours later, I was told to be there around 9. They did not depart until 2 hours later, 11 a.m. But around that time, Karl Lagerfeld and all of the models of the moment strutted out of the hotel. I mean, it was just there was so much pomp and circumstance. You see Karl, you see Daria Werbowy, Friha Beha, Lily Donaldson, all of the editorial models from the ads you see in the magazines, just tall and glamorous, smoking cigarettes, wearing leather, just looking effortlessly cool. And then you see the staff, they are loading these Chanel vans up with gowns and purses and furs. It was just incredible, okay? And I'm standing outside snapping pics on my little Android Samsung phone, trying not to fangirl, but totally fangirling. And then as they were loading up the van, I'm like, Nikki, if you don't hurry up and say something, Karl is going to leave and you're not going to get your picture. So I mustered up the courage to ask for a pic. Karl gave me a once-over, okay? But then he gave me an approving nod, like, I see you, sis. You look cute. You put in some effort this morning. And I did. My Chanel bag and my fit were popping. And he summoned me forward. He also looked at my nails, which were a seafoam green hue. And he said, I like your varnish, which I also loved. And I did not change my nail color for like months after that because it was Karl Lagerfeld approved, right? So anyway, he summons me forward. We take this picture, and my life was literally made. Like 3 months after moving to New York, I met Karl Lagerfeld. So afterwards, I walked into my internship late, like it's like 11:45 at this point. And my bosses were giving me a look like, sis, what possible explanation can you have for being almost 3 hours late for your internship? I told them why, and I showed them the picture, and they all freaked out. They all freaked out and were like, OMG, you met Karl Lagerfeld? You met Der Kaiser? So needless to say, I did not get into trouble that day, thankfully. And as an added bonus, that day, celebrity stylist Memzor Kamaraki, he also happened to be visiting the showroom, and my boss even called me over to him during their appointment and said, tell him the story of how you met Karl. So I got to meet Memzor that day as well, and he also totally freaked out. Like, wow, you met Karl Lagerfeld? So, that was just an incredible day. And it had been such a long, cold 3 months in New York pursuing, fashion PR as my first internship. There were days that I regretted my relocation. But meeting Karl Lagerfeld reminded me of why I left Maryland, because this would never happen in the DMV. The concrete jungle is truly where dreams are made of. What a day. What a fashion moment.
Hi, fashion family. We're launching a contest in the month of March. Leave us a review and you just might win a $100 gift card to one of my favorite online stores, therealreal.com. My obsession list is out of control, but I regularly consign my wardrobe and it's just so easy. They provide a label and you can even schedule a pickup. I love The Real Real, and I'm sure you will too. So we'll announce a winner at the beginning of April. We hope you like what you've heard so far on the Fashion Moment podcast, but this project has truly been a dream come true, and we couldn't do it without your support. If you would like to support the podcast, be sure to subscribe, check out our merch at afashionmoment.com/shop, and of course, leave a review. Now back to the show. Years ago, I spotted a profile piece in Paper magazine on fashion publicist and consultant Bonnie Morrison. In the early 2000s, finding a Black woman in power on the business side of fashion was quite a rarity. I was hungry and diligent about researching any Black person, especially Black women, who paved the way and ascended into some form of a leadership role in the industry. Bonnie Morrison was my muse. She was fashionable, professional, educated, and had an impeccable reputation for being the best of the best. Her mere presence in the industry gave me hope that I too could succeed. Well, thank you, Bonnie, for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
I am so thrilled to have you on A Fashion Moment. I'm literally dying on the inside because I have been following your work since I began working in fashion back. Geez, like my first internship was like 2005, and I was at DKNY Men's Jeans.
Wasn't that long ago?
It's been a minute, and I used to look for any Black people, any brown girls working in the industry, being highlighted in the industry. And there you were, I forget which year it was, in Paper magazine. And I said, who is she? And I just looked around, I was asking, I was reading, and I I mean, I'm in awe of your trajectory, and I am just so here for it. And thank you for really blazing that trail. I know you're not like one to be like in the spotlight very much because you're behind the scenes.
Behind the scenes, for sure. But thank you. But it's very kind. It's very kind, and it means a lot.
But we the Brown girls, we love you. We were watching and you were an inspiration. You are.
Thank you.
Thank
It
means a lot. So just to like start from the beginning. So you grew up in San Francisco.
I did. I grew up in San Francisco. I was born and raised in San Francisco County. It's changed a lot certainly the time since I was born in the middle 70s, as anything will change in 40 plus years. Yes, I was, and it's an interesting place because it's, I would say, even with all of the industry and how San Francisco has become a real magnet and hub for a lot of different types of industry and culturally influential because of tech. Is a fashion wasteland and is not particularly diverse. I mean, I think that there is, there are, when you kind of visit or when you're growing up, you visit we have, the mission system, the mission neighborhood. And, there's a really strong, vibrant Mexican community, which is wonderful. And, the Chinese immigration in San Francisco in the 19th century. Which is hugely vital and important to the economic development and also the development of the railroads and things like that really shaped the commerce of California. But to be Black in San Francisco it's not a huge, it's certainly not New York. When I first moved to New York, when I first visited New York, I was like, oh, wow, there are a lot of Black people here, which is something that I was not used to seeing. So I think that, it's, for all the things that you're saying about, sort of to be a brown girl in fashion, that was definitely that was my own path and my own exploration. It was certainly not a foregone conclusion coming from where I came from. And I actually had a friend the other day who looking at, I was showing her a picture of my family and I had already explained to her, I said, nobody in my family cares or even really knows about fashion. And I showed her a picture of them. And she's like, oh yeah, nobody knows or cares in your family about fashion, which is very funny. Yeah.
I love it. Well, I had to delve into your life and just read as much as I possibly could. And there was a piece where you mentioned that, your parents divorced and you went to live with a wealthy Jewish family. Mm-hmm. Like what was that transition like for you? Like, what was that experience like?
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, sort of the way that I always explain these things is, I'm always inclined to sort of start, my story is not what anybody would expect, or it's not, it's complicated, but everyone's story is complicated. And everyone, every individual on the planet has a unique story. And we're lucky, I think, that we live in an era where we've been given the opportunity, mostly through the internet, to find each other and to find people, to find the commonalities that we have, which is wonderful. But, everyone has their own take on, and all of the different, the nature and nurture of it. That is my family to this day. I mean, it's definitely not, I can tell you, it's not like what you saw in Different Strokes. It's a little bit more that.
What you talking about, Willis?
Exactly. That doesn't look like my story. But that's a family that I had known for a really long time, and to be, and through their daughters, whom I now consider my sisters, with whom I went to elementary school. And so I think I probably encountered them when I was about 8, and then moved in with them when I was 17, kind of to finish college. And the way that it ended up, working out of my kind of staying and maintaining and retaining a relationship with that family was not at all a foregone conclusion or what I expected. But it's just how it worked out. And, I often describe it as, I do have, a lot of fluency in the white world and whiteness. I think part of that is coming from San Francisco. Part of it is, having gone to the schools that I went to in San Francisco. I think some of the ideas that we have, all these things change culturally with different on the basis of, what celebrities, what shows are popular, what musicians are, who our political figures are, what books and what intellectuals are talking, how people are talking about race and other issues around around difference and diversity. So that could be gender, that could be class. So it wasn't as jarring perhaps as it would have been, probably because I was older, but it also wasn't as jarring as it might have been had I not known them, had I been just, sort of placed with them, or had the relationship not developed in the way that it has. But I think if anything, I think it's been very interesting for them. And this is something that we talk about as a family, what it was like to have a member of the family who was not white. And I think the way that it has a bit of what we're seeing, across the country, where people with, and look, not everyone in America, I think we're very accustomed to white people have white friends, Black people have Black friends, Chinese people have Chinese friends, and so on. And I think that's something that is very, as I always say, that's not normal. It's normalized. Yeah. It's normalized. And, for all of the things that we say about America being a melting pot and all these other things, we're really siloed, and ghetto. I don't like when people use a ghetto. Oh, that's ghetto. But, our ghettos, our own sort of cultural and class-based ghettos of this is, for reasons that actually do have to do with racism. And I think that is obvious to people who have studied it and who really understand it and perhaps been the recipients of racism. For people who haven't, they don't see, oh, well, I never really thought about the fact that I only have friends that look like me and why that is. But I think, for them, I think it gave them and I think part of it is also being Jewish, because I think, one of the wonderful things about having that I always say to my family is, because I consider them my family, just as my father, my real father is deceased, but I still obviously have a great relationship with my biological mother, and my mother, what I call her, but it's, but I think, the focus that we have, at least in our family, I can't speak for other Jewish families, but I think part of the faith is the tradition of family. It's the tradition of giving back, the traditions of community, of continuity, of, what is your place and your obligation to others, whether those others are related to you by blood, or whether they are just the people that you see or perhaps don't see, but need your help. And that real belief and investment in, your duty, as a human being. So I think but as I said, I think they've had a really, they perhaps had a bit of a jump start on a lot of the things that people are, that I have, white friends who have said, this is, from the killing of George Floyd, and which obviously set off so many other conversations and so many other conversations about the death of Black and brown people, and also LGBT people and trans people, particularly. Absolutely. And some of the struggles that really set off this, some of these things that had been percolating for a long time, and that people in those communities knew about, but white people perhaps didn't. And I think my family, at the very least, because of through my eyes and through my lens and my own experience, they had a little bit more exposure to it. So I think it wasn't all of a sudden,
where's this coming from?
Seriously, going all of a sudden, it's like slamming on the gas and going at 100 miles an hour. They had a little bit more of a transition into it, but it's definitely an interesting, I'm grateful for all of the people who've been in my life. And I think, and obviously I'm sure that this is the direction that we're heading. I think in many ways, to have that slightly opposing, not oppositional, but opposing view and opposing experience, I think I hope is what's been able to give me a perspective into work and into some of these identities and some of these spaces that's been useful. I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure. No doubt. I would love to know what was going on back in the 90s. I've seen your posts on Instagram, which I love. First of all, how in the world did you come up with your name?
So it's very funny because, well, now, particularly as, there are people I have nieces who are, in their teens, and there are, they're my nieces. So they don't think of me as, their grandparents are not my age. They're a generation ahead of me. But I have been asked the question, like, are you a grandma? And,
Yeah.
and factually, a couple of generations ago, to be 45, like you could, women went directly, whether they went to college or whether they went to, but if they started having, children in their early 20s, you could be a grandma at 45. Now you're pregnant at 49, it actually came from, I get asked this question all the time. It came from when I was probably in my early 30s, maybe late 20s, but I had a bunch of friends, it was sort of publicists, and it was New York, and it wasn't the 90s, it was the 2000s, but this is a time when, brands had parties. And would anybody get at parties, which now feels like it was, 500 years ago, that, the idea of standing in a room of unmasked strangers. Oh my God. And taking with an ungloved hand, like taking things off of a tray and sticking them in your mouth.
Oh my God.
It sounds like the Wizard of Oz or something. It's like a totally other dimension. But I had a friend, and I said, oh God, I feel like a grandma. And he said, but you're fierce, girl, you're fierce. And so we just came up with the moniker Fierce Grandma. And the coda to this is, I used it as my Twitter handle when I signed up for Twitter. What the hell is Twitter? This must have been 2000. I don't even know what year.
Oh my God.
2009 or 2010. And I remember my sister had actually said, oh yeah, there's this thing called Twitter. Because, she was working in Silicon Valley, and she was a pretty early adopter to Twitter. And she said, oh yeah, there's this thing called Twitter, and you can communicate with your friends in 140 character messages. And I was like, wait, explain that to me again. That sounds like the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Who would join that? Who would do that? And but I signed up, and I was like, I'll sign up for Twitter. I was like, but I would never want to use my real name. Right. So I'll use this handle that only the people who know, the people who know, and the people who don't, I've got some cover. And then, of course, social media is the way that we can, we use it. We don't use the phone really. We don't need to use email. We DM each other. We DM strangers. Celebrities DM each other. To go on dates. It's so normal to not have any other information about someone other than, access to their social channels. So, but it stuck. And at that point I was like, well, I'm not going to change it now. So that's your grandma. And there are people, and as I'm sure you have in your life as well, people that you address them as their social handle. It's my friend Phil, and his handle is Pip the Rip. And I actually for a long time didn't know his name was Phil. I was like, oh, Pip. I was like,
stop it right now.
So he calls me Fierce Grandma. I call him Pip. It's just the way it goes.
That is, you never know what's wild. That is wild. It's so funny just going through your Instagram. I did kind of comb through.
I know. I love all your research. You're like an old school. You're like giving Robin Givhan a run for her money. I'm sign you up for the podcast Pulitzer.
Robin is in the neighborhood, and I am a big fan of her writing. And I did read that article she wrote about you in 2011, which I loved. But I too went to a predominantly white school, private school. I was the only Black person who give from my high school class. So your experience sort of finding your way, and, in the Robin Givhan article, you did sort of mention, the role that sort of clothes and presenting yourself and, sort of navigating identity through clothes and just race and class. That was something that I sort of also looked to throughout my life to, whether it was okay, these are all really wealthy white people. I'm a middle class Black girl in a Mexican neighborhood.
Right.
How do I fit into this narrative? There's all of these stereotypes and misconceptions about me? How can I be successful in this life?
Right.
What do I need to do? How do I present myself? So I saw a lot of parallels there.
Well, particularly when, I think it does really astonish me, in a good way. I'll back up. I think, one of the really interesting things about this moment that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and a lot of time talking about is this kind of dyad of the things that you just accepted that it didn't occur to you to ask or to think that they were racist, or, informed by some sort of prejudice. And then, the things that, as we see with this gen, millennials and particularly Gen Z are so upfront about everything. So it's not, the idea, well, don't say, I think it's much more, I won't speak for you, but but I think you will probably be able to relate of, you know what, don't say anything. Don't make a big deal out of it. Don't call attention to yourself. Nobody wants to hear it. Nobody wants to. And I think that was, and that's not just around race. I think it's also around, I was just speaking to someone, sort of in a professional conversation, which is that, and like you said, I was behind the scenes, but, when we were coming up and when I was working at Condé Nast in the 90s, the late 90s, it was, the doctrine was very much, I don't care what you look like. You are to be seen and not heard. I said mustard, not ketchup. You bring the mustard. It's like I said, brown mustard, not yellow mustard. Right. It was, the rigors of the hazing, almost. Yeah. And it's like, and sometimes you were hazed and sometimes you were abused and sometimes it was character building and sometimes it was just eat shit. You know what I mean? And yeah, it really was. Sorry for swearing. Yeah. But I didn't ask you if I could swear. But so I think that, we have I know that my generation, we talked to, Carla Martinez is a friend of mine, the editor of Vogue Mexico and Latin America. And, we have talked about the experiences of being not white. She worked at every magazine. She worked at Vogue, she worked at Elle, she worked at W, Carla has an impressive resume. Carla's here to stay. She's amazing. But we talked about it and she said, and her father was, a physician. She grew up in El Paso and she's very, very in touch with her Mexican heritage. As a Mexican American woman, she now lives in Mexico City. And we said, I guess there were things that maybe disqualified us or made us have to work, or that we knew that, we wouldn't be the logical choices for. But we had families that said, anything your boss asks you to do is your job. So don't bother yourself with what, the hows and the whys. Don't go to HR. Don't go to, we just didn't, I'm not criticizing. I think there are some things that we can learn. I think that we can do a better job of teaching people what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. Yeah, I think that's, I think that's not just the obligation of us as Black women. I think corporate America can do a better job at it. Because I've led white teams, where it's like people were going to HR all the time. And it's like, this is not right. And HR also wasn't saying, okay, when we have this many complaints from this department, what's going on here? We've got to break this down and see what's really going on here and where the problem is. And we've got to figure out how to address it. So I think we have a long way to go in terms of some of those things, but I know that it's a very different, I come from a very different persuasion and like you were saying, whiteness was the norm. And I think, coming out, that was coming out of sort of yuppies and Reaganomics and, this idea of, Ralph Lauren was very much, there were very few fashion houses. They were, that Ralph Lauren was dominant, that idea of the polo pony and that lifestyle. Totally. And there was no internet. So people would murmur that he was, this Jewish guy from the Bronx who was selling ties at Bloomingdale's, but to look at it, it was like the houses in Bedford and the houses in, it was this idea of, so I think it's really different. And I think that what we also realize now is that there are certain, what is don't want to say acceptable because it was never not acceptable, but what you can bring into these what does not disqualify you from certain types of corporate spaces, partially because I think we've had to litigate some of this stuff.
Yeah.
Like your hairstyle or like your
Oh
what
my
bathroom
God.
you use, all of those things. Some of that stuff has had to be litigated, but
Yeah.
you know, the concepts around the attitudes that we have around body positivity, around, around disclosing, what was considered too personal and, and just one's presentation are leaps and bounds from where they were when you and well, certainly when I was coming up, where it was like, this is how you dress. This is how you never step over the line. So it's a lot of, there's a lot of change that I think is, if you've only been exposed to this way, it's hard to imagine that it used to be different.
I'm like, people are actually getting paid now. I remember when internships,
right?
You work for free. And right. I was like, but I'm from California. How am I going to intern?
Right. And they're like, that's, to have people work for no money is against the law. Right. No, it's totally different.
Wild.
It's totally different. And I think, that idea too, and this is, some of the work that, that I've, been interested in, or some of the concepts that I've been interested in talking about, which is that how do we look, if you want to work for free and if you're able to work for free, that's great. And I've done it. I did it.
Yep,
wouldn't do it
same
now.
Here.
But I think that it's not intuitive for everybody that is going to put forward for candidacy, usually a certain type of person. With a certain type of background. And I think that those are the conversations that we're starting to have, which are no shade to anybody. No. It's just, do we want to change that? And if we want to change that, if we want more diversity, if we want different opinions, if we want to really leverage sort of the hybrid vigor of all different types of people and all different types of input, then what do we have to do to make that change? Because it's not going to happen on its own. Because money makes the world go round. It really does.
I mean, this is a capitalist society.
It absolutely is. It's so funny that you say that, because has been sort of the crux of about 10 conversations that I've had this week. That's like where it always, we're still talking about race, we're still talking about equality, we're still talking about it, but what everyone always says is money makes the world go round.
Absolutely. I have an old copy of The Wealth of Nations that, I crack open every once in a while just to remind myself of how it all works.
Totally.
So speaking of Wealth of Nations, you went to Brown University.
I did. Providence, Rhode Island. Little roadie.
How about that? It's really funny. I actually did in graduate school, one of my courses, I did a presentation on Black women in fashion, and you were on the slide, and I educated the class, you, Tracy, Andre, the usual suspects were up there. And afterwards they were like, oh my God, we had no idea that, these types of people were working in the industry. And I'm like, yeah, there's some pretty smart, brilliant, intelligent people from different backgrounds who work in the industry. So I'm curious, what did you study? I know what you studied, but for our listeners, what did you study and major in? And then how did that help you throughout your career?
I studied, Brown has a concentrations, they call them there, modern culture and media and American civilization. And it's, Brown's a little, there's no course requirements, or there's credit graduation requirements, like a number of credits, or units, and concentration requirements. So you have to have certain classes in certain, but it's not like Columbia or places that have a core curriculum where, you read great books, or you read, which I think is great for a certain type of student who really knows what they want to do. And I guess I did know what I wanted to do, which is work in fashion, which you actually don't need to go to college for. And that may sound controversial. And, I think, and this is something some ideas that I'm sort of, and I'll get to the rest of your question in a second, but I don't want to forget this. These are things that I'm have been kind of not pushing, because it's not like I have a real, platform for it yet, but conversations that I've been having with people that I admire and respect, and who are looking at these conversations and how do we change? How do we change opportunity? How do we change the future of work? And the pipeline and all those things. Because we talk a lot about the pipeline, but what's the pipeline within? And within these organizations. And we have to talk about retention, because it's exactly what you're saying. What I'm hearing you say when you say, we didn't know that there were people like this working in these jobs, and we didn't know that this is what they look like, and this is what their background was, and this is what they had the ability to do. I hear so much from, as a lot of this stuff has emerged, and as I've started talking about it, via social, people say, young Black women mostly, I loved fashion. I really wanted to do it. And I labored in it for a couple of years, and then I just felt like I couldn't hack it. I wasn't getting the promotions. I wasn't getting the mentorship. I didn't know, I didn't have the tools, and I didn't know how to access them. And, look, we all have a responsibility to figure out how to get what we need, and then to ask for it, not demand it, ask for it. And to find, the people who are going to help navigate you to those things don't have to be anything. They don't have to be the same gender. They don't have to be the same color. They don't have to be the same socioeconomic class. They don't have to be any of those things. They have to be people. Hopefully, they're people who are invested in. If they're managers, hopefully they're people who are invested in being lights for other people. Yeah. I always used to say, when I worked at Coach, I had probably the biggest team I've ever led. And I said to them, I wasn't intimidated by them. I knew, I reviewed them. I knew how much money they made. I knew, and most of them were about 10 to 15 years younger than I was. So it wasn't going to be an all about you situation where someone who was 27 in her first job was going to somehow eclipse me as an executive at the company.
Right.
But I would always say to them, you give me your best work, and I will give you access to anything that I know to help you in your next job. And that job might be here, but it might be somewhere else. So
you're a dream boss. You're a dream boss.
That's the deal that we're going to make. Thank you. But but how did I learn that? Because I had so many nightmare bosses. That's the truth. But I think that, but not everyone does that. And sometimes, people, and I think we have to start looking at, are we promoting people who have the ability to be managers? Because it's, like the brilliant asshole that they talk about in Silicon Valley all the time. That person may have, there's space, and I think to what you said about being a capitalist society, what ends up happening is we think that everyone thinks you got to keep moving to the top of the pyramid to excel. And that means being the boss. That means being the boss and not having a boss, ultimately. And that becomes the most important person. That's the person who makes the most money. That's the person who gets the biggest bonus, et cetera, et cetera. But not everybody has those skills. You need someone who is good at a lot of different things. We don't just pick people because they have, because they, have the ability to, because they're the biggest earners or they're the biggest, they have to be able to lead an organization. And this is one of the biggest things that we're seeing as we talk about, DE&I, and we're talking about, the liability that companies have exposed themselves to with people who don't want to embrace the manifesto of how work looks and how it feels and who is contributing. So I think, these are really important. These are conversations that have been pushed to the forefront. I think it started a bit with me too, but I think it can go farther, and I think it will. I think it has to. So I think, to go back to the thing about school, I think, so I knew what I wanted to study. I couldn't wait to get out of school because I knew I wanted to go work at a fashion magazine, which interestingly is not what I do now, but I have done it in my life. And I think, something else that I am hoping that can be part of this conversation is, especially given college was expensive when I went, it is even more expensive now. And I think, the ways in which Brown is a great education. I met, I don't remember all the things that I studied because I'm now almost 25 years out. I made some great relationships. I don't see anybody right now, but my college, my two college roommates are dear friends, and I've seen their kids grow up, and I've, become friends with their families and, their birth families. And, my friend Hunter, I'm friends with his sister, and I watch her kids who both just entered college. I mean, it's, that was wonderful. Wow. And, I think about, it's 9/11, and I think about the person that I, walked home with from the Condé Nast building, who's one of my friends from Brown. She worked at Vanity Fair. I worked at Mademoiselle, the daily department at Mademoiselle at the time. So, college is a great place for connections. And, if you go to a fancy college, you have fancy connections. But I think, but I think that we also can be, particularly in these, in spheres like fashion, where we love a brand name, I think those things can be distracting. And I think that they can be, and again, I've had I had a top-notch education from the age of 5 to the age of 22. But, do we start thinking about something that may sound controversial, but, for college, obviously there, for non-technical jobs, do we start looking at, more vocational study? Do we start looking at people with associate's degrees? I don't think that there is anything, particularly for non-technical jobs, as I said, there isn't. And look, there are people, journalists, people who study journalism. I mean, that is something that I very much revere and respect. And there's a big difference between someone who does their research and knows the difference between fact and opinion. Never so important as it is now. But, to sort clothes in a fashion closet, I don't know if you need that. And I don't know. And if are we putting out the message that, for you to be able to pursue the job of your dreams, you have to go to a certain type of school, which maybe even if you're able to get into that school, you might not be able to pay for it. Or you might not even be able to, it might be taxing to your family to transport you there. Or you may have relatives who need, someone, there may be a reason that you stay close to home that don't even have to do with finances. But, people, to be wealthy means to have a lot of options. To not be wealthy means to have fewer options. But how are we, and that's just a fact of life. But how is that affecting the workplace? Because it shouldn't affect the workplace in perpetuity. So what I have sort of advocated, not on a grand scale, is what if we took what if we posted jobs as, this is a job for a college graduate. This is not a job for a college graduate, or this is a job for someone with an associate's degree. This is a job for someone with a bachelor's. This is a job for someone with a master's. And what if you took off of your resume where you went to school? So 2 applicants come in. One went to a state school. And there's some wonderful state schools. I mean, of course, I'm from San Francisco. I mean, university, the UC system, go Bears.
Absolutely. Colton, California. That's where I'm from.
But someone who went to, but not everybody knows that.
Yeah.
And someone who went to, is someone from fashion going to look at someone who went to UNC differently than the person who went to Duke?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I think
that should change.
It's something worth considering, because if we can't, because not everyone is able to, or has been persuaded to let go of some of those biases. I dated a guy who went to Harvard basically because he went to Harvard, and I thought my parents would be like, "Oh, Bonnie's finally figured it out."
Yeah.
He didn't like me. He didn't like me that much. He didn't like me that much.
Those Harvard guys.
I mean, that's a whole other podcast.
Had a couple of those in my day.
But do you know what I mean? Like, he was, and I thought, well, and that was my own, debility. But I think that that was more, it was like, oh, well, he ticks this box. And he certainly talked about it. And I certainly told other people about it. I also, was in love with someone who went to a really great college too. And that was never something that we talked about. So it's just, but it wasn't, and I think that and looking back on it, the person who didn't mention that, or it wasn't part of our relationship, or something that I found out afterwards, that was definitely a better guy. So I think we can get in our own way, thinking that the seal that someone living up to, and I think it goes down to what you were talking about, as yourself, growing up, as how much does someone else's approval mean to us, and can that, and if it's inspiring us to grow and to reach our potential, great. But sometimes it just oppresses us.
Yeah.
And if it's oppressing us, we need to get out from under it ASAP.
Hallelujah. So funny that we're talking about this. I mean, I'm 35 and
Still a baby.
Stop it. Well, I mean, you look 25, Bonnie. Let's just be real. But
that's
anyway,
for you. That's
it doesn't crack. It doesn't crack.
No, it doesn't.
So I literally just came to that, I love me for me. Like, I may not have gone to Harvard. I mean, I went to Howard, but there's this whole thing like, I mean, I had never been around so many Black people before in my life. And I was like, wait, Jack and Jill went up the hill? Like, I didn't know about these organizations and Divine Nine. And, it was just like this new level of like, oh my God, you're from Sweden. And like, I'm from California. I had this Valley Girl accent. And they were like, is she smart? Like, it was a Legally Blonde situation. Like, so there was always this constant, like, can I be accepted? Are you going to accept me? Are you going to accept me?
Totally.
Went to fashion, did really well for about 5 years, and then kept hitting a wall. Couldn't move up. And I was like, what's happening? Had a meltdown, went to grad school to think about it. And it was just like, acceptance, love, self-love. Where is it? I literally, probably within the past year, it finally clicked, like after years and years and years of therapy. And I was like, what? I love fashion. It will never go away. So I write and I do things, but it's like, I'm a Black girl from Colton, California, who some think, sounds like a white girl, but this is how I speak. This is how I talk. I'm from California,
Right.
And that's okay. And it's great, So what you're saying, just embracing yourself and having the bravery, even, because I probably in the 90s, there were probably certain parts of yourself that, maybe you felt you had to sort of.
Oh yeah. And I
censor,
Well, the first thing that I'll say is that I think, this is speaking from the perspective of someone who's 10 years older, but, I think 30 is kind of your first adult age where you're not making, at least this was the case for me, where it wasn't like, oh my, where you get to your birthday party and people are like, what do you wish for? And you're like, not to be as much of a jerk as I was for the last year. You weren't like covering your face thinking I'd do it all differently. If I could just, if I could turn back time. But 30 is like, some of the adult stuff really does. It's some of the stuff that you ideate and you persevere on. And some of the stuff is stuff that happens to you. You've been through, you maybe had your heart, you maybe fallen in love or had your heart broken. Both are very transformative experiences. You've seen some loss, probably maybe of peers, even, things that are really cataclysmic. I think usually for most people around 27, 28, it's where this is my experience and also my observation, where people are getting, if they've been kind of in the same job or same career, if they've just come back out of a graduate degree, they're starting to, you're not at the absolute lowest rung of the totem pole where it's just like every single thing is just like having the balls thrown at you and just trying to, but you maybe are managing someone, your work, you're getting dealt in on more interesting projects. And, usually around that age too, it's a lot of open road, but you can't, you're still, buffered enough by, enough sort of organizational structure that you can't make huge mistakes. So you've got just enough, just enough responsibility. And usually that's also the point where like you've doubled your salary. You will not continue to double your salary through your, you were making $25,000. Now you're making $50,000, but you're not going to, that's not going to happen every 2 years until this infinite growth. And I think 35 is this really, I think, also for women, it's always been talked about as sort of a reproductive milestone. It's, and you're sort of dead in the middle between 30 and 40, and 40s are great too. But I think that is really a time where you can, because you haven't had to be dealing with all of the changes in your 20s. You get out of your 20s, at least I got out of my 20s, and it's like, why do people say that the 20s are so great?
Right.
So you can, so everything that you've done, no matter how slowly you've worked, from the age of 30 to 35, they're all kind of building blocks pointing in the right direction, because you're not testing so much of it out. So but it is, and you kind of learn that self-acceptance and you're able to implement it. But, I think you raised such an important point, and I think it's something that I do see this younger generation starting to change because of the things that we were talking about before, which is, I think I've had to look at the ways in which, when I worked at Condé Nast, for example, and now, not being, if this were a normal year, you would see me in, I basically have it, boiled down to a uniform. I would sort of wear trousers and usually a sweatshirt or a cashmere sweater, sneakers if I can get away with it, flats if it's a little bit more of a formal, formal work meeting. But I do, all of the stuff that I used to do, and I still love fashion. I love it. But that thing of like needing to, how do I fit in? How do I distinguish myself? How do I, that really like hard charging, full contact participation in the system to show that I belonged. And I don't think I would have described, I didn't have the perspective or the self-awareness to be able to describe it that way at the time, but that's really what it was. And it was like, as I've talked about, my experience working at Men's Vogue, it was, I have to own, and I think that this is a really good experience for anyone. I have to own, was there a certain standard? Was it an embrace of whiteness? Was it an embrace of a sort of a classist perspective and all of these other things that I now feel comfortable rejecting or saying, wait a second, that's not cool. I have to own, and I think that this is, as I said, I think it's a really good experience. I have to own what my participation in it was, because I didn't, no one told me I wanted it to validate me. I thought that it was important, and I thought that it was the way. And no matter what it asked of me, even if it made me miserable, even if I didn't believe in it, even if I saw, it's like, well, I'm getting treated well now, and that person isn't getting treated that well. But you know what? Not my problem. Got to keep drilling ahead. That it's like, we, got to lose the underperformers, and, how it forced me to kind of make certain pivots in terms of my own behavior or my own values. Sounds very, there wasn't anything really dramatic that happened, but it was like, you become this machine where it's like, no, you've got to succeed. You've got to succeed. You've got to succeed. Rather than, is this really making me happy? Is this permitting me to contribute to the best of myself? And the best of other people. And I can't say, and I won't say that was Anna's fault or that was anyone else's fault, because I showed up every day and I said, if I keep doing this, it's going to lead to that. Yeah. And that was my own decision. And that was are there things that happened in my job, at any job that I have, where it's like, oh, well, that wasn't cool for me to be asked that, or asked to do that. Or, the way that other person got treated, that wasn't cool. Perhaps not. No, definitely right. Not. But at the other, we have to take responsibility, and we have to always sort of be in maintain that own internal dialogue with, what is this? Is this really important? Is this worth it? Is this worth it? Because nobody's going to do it. Nobody's going to do it for you. You sell your labor, and and that's that's the point of contact with your employer, and that's what they see, and that's what they care about. And they say, we're paying you. This is the contract that you signed with us, even though if it's not an official contract. And what's the problem? That's how they're going to see.
I totally, like, that makes so much sense. And just that responsibility piece, I think, is so important. And, as you're speaking, I just thought back, during like the early days of my career, and just how I was just like, okay, I'm here. I need to make it. So I'm going to internalize those thoughts and beliefs so that I can stay here. Like, there's just this fear, I think, that was sort of looming, like, oh my God, like, I don't want to lose this opportunity. Like, my parents already think, like, what in the world is she doing with her life?
Sunk costs, right?
You're going to end up poor.
Right.
Poor and sad.
But I think luckily we are changing that idea. And I think, with the conversations around mental health, all of these things, the internet has been horrible for a lot of things. But as I mentioned before, I think the internet, one of the things, we have been, obviously it came at a terrible, terrible, terrible price. But these, only the most high profile deaths that we've really talked about this year, which is George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, I think, although there are many others, but I would say that those are the ones that have really been at the forefront, and they've maintained kind of their primacy. I think we have been able to, and this wasn't by design, but I think to almost approach the conversations about race and about empowerment, personal empowerment, gender empowerment, racial, all of those things, in the ways that we have, that we've been lapped by sort of the mental health, I don't want to say industrial complex, but the mental health conversation where people say, we are shining a light on mental health. We're talking about how important it is. For some people, it's medication. For some people, it's therapy. It's, CBT. For some people, we talk about Talkspace, and we talk about, there are all these apps and there are all these. And I think, in meditation, we talk about, the importance of talking, the importance of.
Wait, I do all of these, Bonnie. Hold on a second.
Totally. But, telling people what's going on with us. And I think that lifting the veil on those things, I think has been tremendously helpful. And in so doing, we've even been able to change our language about mental health, mental illness, mental health, wellness, the importance of balance, the importance of, and I think that we would do well to sort of take that approach to others. And also because this is the other thing about that particular crusade. It's come out of the shadows, and it hasn't just been for people with, bipolar disorder, or for people with depression, or with people with, this is your thing to deal with. This is your thing to deal with. Discuss it with your clinician, discuss it with whatever protocols but don't ever bring this into your workspace. Don't ever bring this into, and obviously, people have to negotiate a way that feels comfortable for them and doesn't impede or can't be used against them. And I think that it's the same for really almost anything, any sort of point of difference. But I think that we have to actually talk about these things and to actually bring them, and to not say, well, I'm just gonna grin and bear it, or this isn't, or nobody else cares about this, or that idea of like, who are you? Because it's so abusive, that idea of talk about like dating inappropriate people. It's like, well, this is a great person who has like this, that, and the other thing on their resume. They're great on paper. Who are you? You're dying inside, but who are you to break up with them? I mean, that's insane. If you had a friend who came to you and was like, well, there's a litany of bad things about this person, but, who am I to, who am I to break up with him? And you'd be like, that doesn't sound right.
It's crazy. Yeah.
And I think we maybe need to inform some of our, professional development with a little bit of that, a little touch of that attitude.
That's such a fun way to think about it. I've never thought of it from that perspective.
Right.
That's amazing. Well, I'm going to lighten it up a little bit, just a little bit.
Okay. I'm ready.
I'm going to ask you really quickly, what is on the minds of all the fashion folks out there? How in the world do you get an invitation for a KCD event? Go. I don't know that, I don't know if there are so many events anymore. I think we're going to see some really interesting changes, right? Yeah.
On, in the future. And even, starting with the resort shows and everything this summer, I thought it was really interesting, like what J.W. Anderson did of kind of his, paper dolls. And
I wanted those. I was like, Robin, I saw it on Robin's Instagram and I was so jealous.
I mean, also, I have to say, having worked in PR for as long as I did or have, or whatever it is that I do now, I like and I know from friends who do, who are on sort of, press, gifting mailing lists or whatever. Mm-hmm. dealing with all of that mess during COVID, when people are like, because I had friends who were like, I don't want anyone walking up to my house with a box.
Right.
Like, I don't, you know what I mean? Like, it's filled with germs. And I mean, it was to coordinate that, and people not being at home, and people and places where it's like a PO box, so you can't FedEx. And I mean, I cannot, I mean, the poor, they probably weren't interns. They were probably, especially with staff furloughed, it was, you probably had, a manager or coordinator who's doing the job of 10 people.
Yes.
They're like, now I'm the janitor, and now I'm the host, the office manager, and now I'm in. So I think that it's going to be an interesting look, fashion, we've all dealt with a reckoning, and fashion is certainly not immune to it. But I think that when we are, it's changed our, COVID has changed our ability to consume. It's not just the things that we want. There are still people who want to wear high heels. I didn't before. So although I have a closet full of them, but I didn't before. So so that doesn't apply to me. And I still love fashion. I've bought a couple of things during COVID, especially spending all of, your screen time is like 12, 13 hours a day. So some of that's online shopping. Some of that's e-com, but, I think that how we present these things, and people, it will be, none of these, we've seen some rebounds in sectors like, food service and things like that, where depending on regulations, people have been able to, or gymnasiums, or people have been able to go back. And so the people who were unemployed, 6 months or, immediately after, as a result of closures, didn't have work, and now some of them are back, but it's going to take a while. So I think fashion, I think how we present, and I think that fashion designers have had to be kind of like, Tom Ford was saying the other day, I furloughed a bunch of people. Like, I can't have, some run with some splashy, especially, for something that is so, the production values on a Tom Ford, a Tom Ford runway show. That's not a criticism. And also in the work,
it's gorgeous.
And in the work that I'm doing with the CFDA, effectively, Tom Ford is my boss. So
absolutely. Hey, Tom.
I think, hey, Tom, I think that was an appropriate decision, but I think that, it's going to be really interesting. Where I think it's great, though, is that, we can use this as we've seen at other times in history. We can, the ingenuity and also the ability, I think, does it create opportunity for people who haven't necessarily been able to compete, not in terms of talent, but in terms of resources. So it's like, if everybody's now indoors and we're not doing parties where, or big splashy, launches, or where we're doing things, then hopefully the cream rises to the top in terms of talent, but also hopefully, people will really be forced to look back into their own, well springs of innovation and creativity, so that they can distinguish themselves and perhaps really, grow. And I think that is because, as everyone said, whether we like it or not, really, because I have gone back to the gym this week, and there aren't a lot of people there. I think that there are people, and I look at my parents who are in their 70s, and they're safer at home. So I think they would never, my parents would never admit that they're old. Hi guys. They would never admit that they're old, but they, and they're in wonderful health. And for that, I'm really grateful. But I think that, the idea of, people don't really feel like it's safe to come out yet. And I respect that. And I think that is, and I actually, really, it's been hard. It's certainly been hard for people with kids. It's been hard for, for some of us, it's been a much greater adjustment than others. And I think that, the people who are still really staying the course, for their safety and for the safety of other people, and not really complaining about it. I think that's not a very American way, is it?
Yeah.
But I think it's, you talk to people who, grew up in post-war Europe, and they're like, we're used to deprivation. Right. I mean, not that this isn't unprecedented for anybody, but say, as Americans, we want our big cars and our big airplane seats and our big, and like, where's mine? We'll buy it on credit. And I think that this has been a real shift, one that I hope we can learn from, for American life. So I think fashion shows, maybe outdoor ones, maybe we're looking for, but I think that whole model, I think because of even before COVID, that whole model of PR agencies, runway presentations, the frequency of 8 collections, 8 collections a year, of, participating in every, opening, massive stores, like all of that. I don't have many predictions on what it will look like, but it's going to be different. It's going to be really, really different. So, and hopefully the opportunity, what we've been talking about, what I've been talking about with people is, I think the other benefit of it is for people who have felt like they couldn't participate because they didn't live in New York, or because they didn't, or because it was only the sort of the tippy top of editors or influencers or customers. Does this give them the opportunity to participate and to dream and to be inspired in ways that will bear fruit for them down the road? I think that instead of looking at mourning what we've lost, perhaps forever, I don't really know what forever ever means, but mourning what we've lost, it's like, what is this? Or is this an opportunity to reach new and different audiences? Because companies, to stay competitive, I think the other beautiful thing about talking about diversity is that we can now really honor and reflect on how the participation and also the capital of so many different kinds of communities is what's going to make these companies, drive these companies forward. It's not just, if you even brands that are associated, like we talk about a Ralph or a Tory, or things that we think have a particular, that's a white girl brand, or that's a streetwear brand, or it's all wrapped up together, and everybody wants all of those customers.
It's so beautiful. It's really beautiful to see.
Yeah.
I mean, I was just looking through the September issues, like, what is going on? Never. Yeah. I mean, honestly, Bonnie, would you ever in your life, think that this would be happening right now, and brands saying Black Lives Matter, like, publicly and like in their branding? Like, isn't this insane?
No way. And it's really funny because I can't remember. It might've been 2000. There was a Gap Kids commercial. And I think it was a holiday commercial, and it was this girl band. They were very cool. And I think it was like I forget what it was for, maybe Chords or something like that. And they had, and it was, they must've been like 10 years old. And the lead singer they sang "You Really Got Me." And the lead singer was this Black girl with sort of natural hair. And she like had great moves and like swivel hips. And I remember thinking, and I must have been in my 20s at that point. I looked at it, it's on YouTube. I'll send it to you. And I remember, it put a lump in my throat. I was like, if I had seen that when I was a girl, if I had seen that you'd have this massive company. I'm from San Francisco, so obviously the Gap was huge then.
Yeah.
Everybody in the world, everybody in San Francisco who was born in the 70s worked at a Gap. We didn't have Old Navy then, but you worked at Banana or you worked at Gap. You would go home and you folded sweaters in the summer.
I love it.
Sweaters and t-shirts. But I remember seeing that and thinking, what that would have meant to me to see this Black girl with natural hair front and center on she's probably biracial, but Black to everybody else. And biracial is Black. I mean, it's no shade there, but
hey, Kadada Jones, she was my muse.
Totally.
In the ads, Kadada Jones with the short hair.
Totally. No, but I think that it's that seeing that, and because you hear that a lot, for people, you can't be what you can't see, and I think that we do have to adjust that, because we do have to dare greatly. We have to encourage people who feel that they're different or feel that they're marginalized. There is a place for you in fashion, because if you think about how fashion has been pushed forward, those were, if you think about 50 years ago when it was Halston and Bill Blass and these people who some names are names that some people know and not everyone does, but they were gay boys coming from the Midwest, and there was no place for them but New York. So there's a tradition of that in fashion, and so I think that we can embrace it, and I think that there's what I would encourage. And perhaps it's easier said than done, but what I would encourage, people of color to really think about is you don't have to have a role model to do it. Do it because you want to do it. Because that's how white people think. White people think, men don't think I'm the first man from Iowa, or I'm the first.
Yeah.
They want it if it distinguishes them. If it's a place that they can get, they can say, did you know that I was the first? But I think we need to be more focused on, this is what I want. How do I get there?
I love that. I am officially, that was my word of the day. Like, I am good. I am motivated. Let's go take over the world.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
It's a new day.
I'm ready.
Oh my gosh. Like, I mean, I could literally talk to you for a million years. Like,
I know
this has been fun.
This has been really fun. I appreciate all the work that you put in, all the work that you put into this. I was talking to my family about this the other day. It's like, don't worry about having to work harder than other people. Worry about having to work hard, because you're going to have to work hard. You know, it's like even like LeBron isn't sitting on the couch before the game.
No.
he's in practice. He's lifting weights. That was the most, I think, one of the most magical things. I don't really follow sports, but it feels like so long ago, and I took Kobe's death hard. But you think about how hard he worked, and that Mamba mentality, and I'm not super competitive, but how competitive he was, and how he really, that he would grind and grind and grind. And that's what's required. That's what's required. And I think that and don't think about measuring yourself up to other people. Make sure that your standards as high as it can possibly be. And there will be people like you and people like me who are making sure that there are places for people like that. Because that ethic is really important. It's really important. And, and also don't worry about how many more, don't compare yourself to others in any way. Don't worry about how many more chances someone has, or the way that, as we were talking about before, things are easier with money. I mean, they're easy. Yeah. It's nicer. It's nicer to sit in first class than it is to sit in basic economy. Let me tell you. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we won't all get there. So I think we have to focus on being the best that we can be, and it doesn't matter who's been there before. It doesn't matter who, and to angle ourselves towards and to show that we're willing to do what it takes, and finding the people who've got the right instincts and who want to help other people. Because that's true leadership. And those are the people that we want. Those are the people that we want to make ourselves in the image of. So if you can find those people, then
found her, looking at her right now.
But it's
you
like,
my
put me in,
Bonnie.
Put me in coach, not coach seat. Coach, like coach with a capital C, the coach of the team. Like a John Thompson, like a Phil Jackson.
I love it.
Not basic economy. Don't put me in there. But I'll ride there if I have to. If I have to, I'll do what it takes. And I think that's the message that we have to, because we know how to work hard.
Yeah, we know absolutely. But when you love it, it's just, I could do it all day. Like, I love
what you
it
do, and you'll never work a day in your life. That's what they say. That's what they say.
I love reading, writing, studying, working. I love it. And I love fashion.
Yeah. No, I love it.
Where did your, I have to ask, where did your love for fashion come from? Was it
total mystery. Someone
in your family, or?
Nope. No way. It's a total mystery. I have no idea. I started, my friend Amy Standen, and I would, we're total latchkey kid era, stuff that you would be on the cover of the New York Post if you just let your 8-year-old kids just watch MTV and eat a bunch of junk food and read fashion magazines. People would be like, that is literally the worst parent in the world.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So my friend Amy Standen and I think she at the time was maybe in 5th grade and I was in 4th grade. Maybe she was in 4th grade and I was in 3rd grade. And we bought, it wasn't a September issue, but she loved Vogue. And I think Vogue was $3 then. I think it's $8 now. And we went to Walgreens or something like that. And we bought Vogue. And I remember reading my first Vogue and I was just like, I love this. And, tearing out the pages and sticking them on the wall, like the Calvin Klein underwear ads, which were quite racy for a 3rd grader.
Yes.
But we, that was the that's, I think from that point, I loved the fantasy of it. I loved brands. I loved models. I loved designers. I loved, I loved all of it. And I think, that's where it started. And from that point on, it was, cause it was also, I think at that time we really engaged in popular culture in a different way.
Yeah.
Because it was, because the monoculture definitely existed. So it was like, there was, you could learn almost everything about subjects clustered around like one particular hub. And I think that fashion was integrated in fashion it was obviously an industry, but it hadn't sort of generated all the offshoots that it has now. So, and also, cable, sort of basic cable was emerging. So they needed programming. So you would see, CNN had Style with Elsa Clench, and, there was more, fashion was more kind of integrated and kind of composed through there was House of Style with Cindy Crawford.
Yeah.
That came later.
Oh my goodness.
So that was, and it wasn't, it certainly wasn't how we consume it now. So I think, but that's where it came from. But yeah, I guess my mother liked to sew, but I think that's because she's very Virgo. And she sort of likes the technical. She's mathematically minded. She sort of likes the technical aspect of it. But it wasn't. But certainly when I was 10 and I wanted an Hermes bag, my parents were like, "What the hey? Like, where did she come from?" So who knows? I literally have no idea. I mean, it maybe would have been more useful to be a prodigy at something else that actually made money rather than spent it. But that's just the way it went.
I love it. Oh my goodness. Did you watch the Style Network by any chance?
I think the Style Network, I've seen the Style Network and I remember working with them, on shows, but I think that was maybe post.
Yeah.
That was maybe because then when I left for college, there was no cable in the dorms. So I don't even think we had, and that was definitely the era of like must-see TV. So we were all like, that's what we were all.
You're like, over it.
Totally. But I was still, I think my senior year in college, I lived with two guys. And we all had sort of our interests. They were like really into Nintendo 64. And
yes.
Are
you into video games?
And I never played video games, but I had 12 magazine subscriptions when I was a senior in college. And they were like, what? They're like, why do we trip over magazines wherever we walk? So what are you going to do?
It's like, whatever. Oh my. So you are now are you working with or for the CFDA at the moment?
I mean, anyone that you work with, you end up working for. I know
right?
That's my life as a consultant. So the quick answer is when I started, when all of this, I've been trying to figure out as we're mentioning, fashion has changed and how people consume fashion and how much fashion they consume. And fashion's been sort of taken to task for, issues like sustainability and people, you get to a certain point, you got a lot of stuff. So, what's our footprint? What's fashion's footprint? And I think we also in, the early 2000s had a groundswell of all of these designers and people starting their own businesses, and there were too many. So, that didn't necessarily reflect what people needed or how they spent anymore. So, because designer clothes are really, really, really expensive. They're too expensive, in my opinion. They're too expensive for anybody, even though, the world has a lot of billionaires now, but I think billionaires, but let me tell you, I have yet to see a billionaire who has more than 2 legs and 2 arms and 2 heads. So it's like, there's a critical mass of what you're going to be able to buy. And, if you look at people like, Jack Dorsey or Jeff Bezos, they kind of dress the same way all the time and kind of schlubby, right? So, so I think, but I was contemplating, is this, and I talked to people about, going back to consulting, which I'd done from 2008 to 2014, and, working on different kind of brand strategy, but the job of PR has really, 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 really changed. Certainly as it was done when I did it or when I was coming up in it. All to do with, digital marketing and, the sort of the how print has shifted, et cetera. You get it. I don't need to explain any of this. So, so, figuring out, I've applied to, some kind of SVP jobs and, maybe thought about doing crisis communications and a couple of other things that I was interested in. And then again, I started really thinking about and being able to talk about race, and not vis-a-vis fashion, although fashion's what I know. And it's like, is there an opportunity to maybe put these things to be of use and to put these things together? My interest in and my background in public relations and some of the crisis stuff that I was talking about, but also like, but having been a manager and having served on committees in my other jobs about traditions and work culture and really being jazzed and really finding that kind of stuff really interesting. And so I called Stephen Kolb, and the CFDA had made their announcement, and at the beginning of June about Black Lives Matter, and really fostering equity in the fashion, being a leader in fostering equity in the fashion business, through their own programs, but also in conjunction with their member body. And I called Stephen and I said, "Hey, Stephen, I think I want to pivot a little bit to do." And Stephen had been my client when I worked at KCD. I was actually his first publicist at KCD. He started a couple of months after I started at KCD. And so Stephen is someone I adore, Stephen Kolb, the CEO of the CFDA. And he and I have been friends, well after I left. And so, and I said, "Hey, I just want to kind of throw it out there that I think I'm going to start doing this. And I would love to work on anything that you guys have, whether it's on a project basis, whether it's you just want my opinion, if you want to run something by me, if you want me to talk to somebody, I would love to do it because I'm going to do this. And like, would you guys be my client?" And he said, "I'm going to get right back to you." So he connected me with Cassandra Diggs, who has since then been promoted to president of the CFDA. Stephen's now CEO and Cassandra's president. We started talking about some things that they were working on, that she had with the group that had created the board statement. Tom Ford's been very involved, which is terrific, and everyone in the CFDA has been supportive and has really been on board with this. I mean, I know it's one thing to say you're on board because it's pretty controversial to say that you're not on board, but it's another thing to do it. And so through that came the opportunity to work in this capacity with, they had created this role. And I am working and the CFDA has become my client, but in a more official way, where it's not just, hey, they're sort of sending a document over to me and saying, "Hey, if you get to this, would you just check and see if there are any typos?" So that's been really amazing, and I've been having some conversations with a couple of other. I still have one PR client that I work with. He's a great woman-founded business called The Sleep Code. And which is sort of about sort of sleep as wellness. Sort of the fundamental piece of wellness. It's like the thing that we all have ample opportunities to do right now, but nobody can really get good sleep for a number of reasons.
I have 2 toddlers.
On top of everything else, right? On top of everything else that is distracting us and like making us toss and turn at night. So I've been working with them as a brand, which is really kind of, beautifully curated e-commerce around sleep. And then a couple of other conversations that I'm having with some really interesting conversations that I'm having with some people that I really, really admire, but have never sort of worked with.
Amazing.
And that has been really great. And I just have to put in a plug for, in particular, there were 2 women whom I'd known, enough to say hello, but not had it certainly had not had a warm, friendly, let's go out to dinner or even a coffee relationship with. And they have, they had sort of takes on this, on Black Lives Matter and sort of, more kind of social justice at work and, through the companies that they work with. And I just reached out to them and I said, "Hey, would you be interested in do you want my 2 cents?" And they were so welcoming, and we had, as I said, 2 people that I think have done some really, really amazing things. And I think those have, and who knows if they'll turn into work, but I think they have turned into, I can't speak for them, but really, really productive, conversations with people who I think have a lot to contribute to this business. So so the plug that I will make is that what's the worst that can happen? Reach out, do it in a respectful way. You don't have to push your way into anything. You don't have to demand. You don't have to tell people what they're doing wrong, but say, hey, if you ever wanted to talk to me about this, or I'd like to talk to you about this, do you have time? Do you have 15 minutes? Do you have 20 minutes? And literally the worst that happens is something that happens 1 million times a day, which is that someone does not respond to your email.
Right.
So, but like we should be able to like get over, feeling crushed by that by now. I mean, I send out, as a PR person or as as trying to interview people. I mean, how long did you have to track me down for this? And you sent another email.
Hey,
I mentioned that's saved in my drafts from May. So it's, I would say, obviously do it in a way that feels comfortable for you and you think that it's going to elicit the best response. But, what's your question? Figure out what your question is and then go and ask it and see what develops.
I love that. So much. And, I have to ask, because this is a fashion moment, what is your favorite fashion moment of all time? It can be personal or professional or both in your case.
That's a good one. You'd think that I would have this more at my disposal. Actually, there are quite a few, so I'm going to have to pick whatever I think is the best one. I've had quite a few. I think I have had the benefit, the incredible privilege of working with amazing people and having experiences that I just, the spectacle, of course, but also just people that whose work I really admire and people that I never would have imagined that I would meet. I think there's a lot, like, you do get to meet some of your idols. I think about Tim Blanks, whom I had seen on television on Fashion File. And I
love it.
I finally had to stop saying to Tim, when I would had to stop cornering him at a party and saying, I want to tell you that like, this is an amazing, like I told my mom I met you. And it was like, usually when you tell someone that, like, I've been watching you on television since I was a little kid, it just makes them feel old. But
I did that with Lauren Azierski and she kind of ran away when I first met her.
Right. They're like,
but she's my first interview for the show. So,
So you're like, you're saying I'm old. But I have to say that I probably go back to all the time that I spent when I worked for PR consulting, and I represented Dries Van Noten, and Dries still has, many of the people that Dries has working for him have worked for him for years and they still work for him. And, some of the shows are and Dries's perspective is so magical, and he is such a, he's this very self-effacing man, but so smart and also, quite convicted about what he, I think people think of him as shy or they think of him as, but he's quite convicted and I think he has a very, very clear vision. And, for his 50th show, which is now over 10 years ago, his 50th show, he did this presentation where we were outside of Paris, in a place where everybody was getting lost and people didn't all have cell phones. And it's when you would still, get your cell phone from the office in Italy. And it was like a +39 number. And like you had to put the chip in it, you had to charge it. I mean, it was nothing. I mean, people don't understand how easy it is now. And, people, cab drivers and people are like, oh, I was and cab drivers in France were like such jerks. And they were like, no one would drive me out here. And I remember, some people like tried to take the not the metro, but the train. And, it was just like, cause it was in La Courneuve, and La Courneuve is a stop on the way out from the airport. Anyway.
Yeah.
And we didn't know, it was at 8 p.m. and there was like another show ahead of it. And but Dries did this, the clothes were incredible. And it was probably spring. I was working for PR. So it was sometime between 2004 and 2006. It might have been 2005, but it was a spring collection and these beautiful clothes. And what he wanted this party where he wanted this rock, and it was a dinner. And he wanted this sort of the idea of this raucous party where people were dancing on the tables, and all of the models came walking. They had built this, it was like 300-meter table, and all of the guests were seated on either side of it. And that became the runway. People were sitting, even the runway was the table where people had eaten the food. And the models came walking down, and it was just, and we worked, and we were out there until, it was so complicated. I mean, all of the production around it, not that we did the production, but the people getting their invitations and getting them out and organizing transportation, and there had to be buses, and there had to be, and some people had their own cars, and then the cars had to, we're working on like walkie-talkies, and it wasn't like I said, it wasn't the age of the iPhone. It was still about 5 years before the iPhone, and even Blackberries. Not everybody had Blackberries. But it was just this, it was such a moment. And Dries was I went to a number of McQueen shows as well. The designers, and when we talk about shows and the importance of shows, I think I'm happy for shows in some way to go away, because what you really remember at the end of the day is the ones, you remember beautiful clothes, of course. And I think Valentino has done that beautifully. I think, in the days of Celine, I loved everything Celine. Marc Jacobs does it, but these shows that were a moment, and you saw, and it was, to Ravel's Bolero and all of these, and this parade in the finale of this parade of women walking down in these beautiful clothes, with Dries, this very layered kind of, it's a bit folkloric, but also the prints were amazing and the volumes were amazing. And just to see all of these women walking down and people just burst into spontaneous, people were sobbing. I mean, it was just, those moments. And I had a lot with Dries where it was where there was really such, even though you'd watched the rehearsal, even though you'd seen all the clothes, when you saw it all put together, and you just felt there was something so stirring about those moments. And like I said, McQueen was definitely like that too. Perhaps not the final. Well, some of the shows. I mean, some of the shows, his show that people, with the big sort of hoof boots, with the that wasn't as emotional. But some were just, were just these really lyrical, beautiful, and to have been in the thick of all that, and to have seen sort of all the stress of getting people there, and people are yelling and walkie-talkies, and and pushing physically pushing people out of backstage, and all this other stuff, and then just to have that moment of calm when the lights go down as the PR person, and you rip off your headset. And you're like, okay, everybody's in their seats. You're like, okay, we're going to close doors, ready to go. And I have to say, I'm glad I don't have to do that anymore. I don't think I have the stamina for it, but it was a magical time, and I just loved it. And I loved Dries, and I loved everyone who worked for him and worked for him. And when I actually made my last season before I went to KCD, I remember going to the bathroom downstairs in the office in Paris, in the Marais, and just sobbing and thinking, I'm just going to miss these people so much. And it was that was a really beautiful, formative time. And I think, the sort of the applicable message that I would say from that is a little bit about what we were talking about before, is, those days in your career, or before you have a lot of responsibility, or before you're divorced from the things that you love doing, but you can no longer do anymore because it's for a younger generation to do. And you're, spend more time in meetings or making decks or whatever it is, or, making more executive level decisions. I hope people savor that, I think there's a real emphasis on, you see young women either as bloggers or who founded their own companies who've been very, very, very successful. And I think that it is easy as people have, as I said, college is much more expensive than it was when we went. So, people taking on loans, and, parents who may have, depleted their savings or have lost value of their portfolios because of the recession and all of those things. And I think people are much more conscious of things like that. And, when you have people like, everyone displaying what they own and what they wear and what they have, and that sort of a whole Kardashian moment, that, high consumption, values. But I think, to be able to just really savor that moments where you're not the most important person, you're just the person who can kind of, who's been instrumental in helping it all come to pass, but also who still has the ability to take it all in. I hope people still enjoy that part, whether you're working in a magazine, whether you're working in a PR firm, working for a designer, you're working on a technical side. I mean, there's so many opportunities to be in this business that are not just the things that we see, and are not just sort of at the the high visibility roles. And that those are where the best moments in my career were. and there will still be other great moments in my career. And I loved managing people. I loved my team. I loved all that, but it was different. It wasn't a moment. It was a much longer, process. It was a longer play. So, savor those things. It doesn't matter that you're not making all the money. It doesn't matter that you're not, even sometimes that you're not recognized. I would see the people who like knew all the models and knew all the, the sort of, PR people who knew everybody and who were sort of inducted into that world and, got welcomed by the key hair and the key makeup. I thought, when can I be that? It happens, it all happens it all happens in its own time. But, to be kind of this wide-eyed kid, that was, I have a lot of love for that person because she was just beginning to see it all happen. And I think that, she was, and she had a lot to learn, and she really threw herself into it with a lot of vigor and enthusiasm. And may we all have that,
I love that. Thank you so much, Bonnie. This has been amazing.
This was great.
I am just so floored. I've learned so much today. I am so inspired. And just speaking to you, it just reminds me of like why, the why and the magic, and having other folks in that space who understand that is just phenomenal. So thank you.
This was fun. I mean, I think it's so great that you're doing it. And I think that as I was just saying, I think there's so many different ways to be a voice and to contribute and still participate and learn from this. And, we should sample them all, as many as interest us. We should see and see where it takes us. Cause I think it's a really, we want to keep growing, and we want to keep exposing ourselves to new things that make it, that keep it interesting and keep it fresh and expand our horizons. So I'm so glad that you're doing it, and you're doing a great job.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for joining me for this week of A Fashion Moment. If you like what you hear, we'd love for you to join our community of listeners and spread the word about the show. We also want to hear from you. Share your favorite fashion moments and dream guests with us by sending an audio clip or email to afashionmomentpodcast@gmail.com. Or you can tag us on Instagram @afashionmoment, and you could be featured on next week's episode. And don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review and let us know what you think. Until then, see you next time for another fashion moment. Podcast production by Rebecca Rashid and John Taylor Williams. Digital media production by Megan Porras.
This recording carries a Creative Commons 4.0 international license. Thanks to Patrick Patricios for their song, Hot Coffee.